This is Jeff, and in the last video we did a quick orientation of the interface of After Effects. And now we're going to look at the 6 foundational elements of After Effects: compositions, layers, animations, 3D, effects, and rendering. If you can get these 6 foundations, that's largely going to start you to really hit the ground running. Of course, we're going to go deeper into each one of these, but this is a quick start guide, and this will get you up and running really fast. So let's go ahead and start. If you'd like, at the beginning of this chapter page in Canvas, there is a link to all the exercise files that I'm using. So all these Walt Disney Concert Hall assets you can have and you can play with on your own. There will be an exercise after this for you to complete your first animation and upload it to YouTube, where we'll be turning things in. So you can use those assets to generate your first animation, or you can use your own assets if you like. So let's get started. The first thing we're going to cover is compositions. We looked at it a little bit before. Compositions are basically arrangements of elements that are both stacked in layers in this composition window and arranged in a timeline. So they're both, vertically and horizontally arranged. And you can have multiple compositions in a single project. For example, I can go up here and do a new composition. Since we're really not going to use it, I'm just going to create it and keep the settings. And you can see now that we have a second composition here in our project panel, and you can see it's also displaying in the timeline. My composition 1 is still there. And so I can hop between these compositions. If I don't want this in my timeline, I can simply close composition 2, but it doesn't delete it. Composition 2 is here, and it's still something that I can play with and alter. Additionally, when you import files, you can import them as compositions. So this is very handy if you have a Photoshop file that is separated into layers, or an Illustrator file that is separated into layers. Because what After Effects will do is when it imports a layered file from either Photoshop or Illustrator, it will separate those into layers that you can then use in your layered compositions. Let's see how that works. So under Composition, under File Import, I'm going to import a file, and I'm going to select WDHC, Walt Disney Concert Hall Graphics. We're looking at all acceptable files, and previously we had imported things as footage, and now we're going to import them as a composition, and we're going to retain the layer sizes. So the relative relationship to those elements will stay the same. If you just do composition, it will blow up all those elements to be the size of your canvas, and that's essentially going to remove their proportions from each other. So let's go ahead and keep it a composition, retain layer sizes, and say OK. So you can see what happens is it has created a composition here based on the Walt Disney Concert Hall graphics, and then with it, it has its own little assets in a folder. Of course, if I double click on this composition, it shows this composition, which is essentially a layered version of lines versus text of this Illustrator file. But we're not going to just use this composition on its own, so I'm going to go ahead and close it from the timeline. I am going to use its raw assets. So I'm going to take these and drag them into the composition 1 that we started with, and now these are with our regular timeline composition that we started to begin with. So that's a good introduction to compositions. The next element we're going to talk about is the layers element, or the layers foundation. So each one of these are layers, and I'm going to go ahead and you can move them around. These are already selected, so once you have something selected, you can click and drag it up. So now Walt Disney Concert Hall is on the top. Layers allow you to individually arrange and move your different elements. They can be hidden and turned off. So I can hide I can hide and show these different elements. I can also go solo. So if you're not quite sure which one is which, you can select this and it will show only that. So solo basically allows you to isolate that thing. It turns everything else off. You can also lock them. There's a lot of other stuff here that we are going to get to, but I think the only thing you need to know now about all this stuff is that there are lots of different columns in these layers that show different functions, and those can be removed or changed, which is great in its versatility, but sometimes will be a little intimidating when you find things missing. So in order to get all of your columns to the way you like them, if you right click or two finger click on one of these columns, you'll see a column list and you can select and deselect things. So for example, I can hide the layer blending modes, and if I miss them, I can click on it and go to the columns and I can show the blending modes. So that's, I think, something important about columns. I'm sorry, about layers. Related to layers is this next foundational element called animations. So in order to get to animations, we're going to have to look a little bit deeper into layers. For example, each one of these layers, it can be opened up, and you'll see by default there's a little transform menu in there. This transform menu allows you to isolate the anchor point, which is the center. That's the center little element. The position, the scale, the rotation, and opacity. There's a nice series of shortcuts here. So if you have a layer selected, you can basically say, type A for anchor, P for position, S for scale, R for rotation, and opacity. They don't let you use O, they use the T sound at the end, opacity. Think of it, it's the last option, so you use the end of that word, opacity. So that's actually a nice shortcut for getting to these things. So what I'm going to do is all you can do is like select the position, then you can go up, and this is the lines. I can select those lines and I could move those lines wherever I want. I can also scale them up to another size. If you hold shift, it locks the proportion. If you don't, you can move it around. So or play with its proportions. So I'm going to make this big and move it down. I'm going to do the same with the graphics. That's a little too big. So each one of these layers can be moved and adjusted and scaled and played with according to these transform properties. Now, these properties are not fixed. This is where we get into animations. So for example, the Walt Disney Concert Hall, we could have move up into place. So for example, here, each one of these little functions we've looked at has a little like stopwatch by it. Now, if I select on, oops, that's lines. If I select into the text and select position, and I click this, it's going to open up it's going to create a little keyframe. That keyframe appears right here in the timeline. So I can add, if I move the timeline to another place, I can add another keyframe. You don't start with the stopwatch. You add another keyframe by clicking on the little keyframe button, and that's going to add it where the timeline is. You can hop back and forth between these keyframes simply by going back and forth like this. And once you have once you are on a keyframe, you can adjust something's positioning. So for example, these are the coordinates listed X and Y. X comes first, Y comes second, and it's always horizontal then vertical. Think you have to get to the mountain, travel to the mountain before you can climb it. So I'm going to make this go down. So now I have brought in, if I press spacebar, it will play. It's rendering as it goes, so it'll be a little choppy. But essentially, that's it. And if I press play again, it'll be a little more in real time. So timeline is basically a way that you can play with opacity, you can play with scale, rotation, etc., and have all these elements be dynamic over time. That is the third foundation of animations. The third part that is important is, or the foundational concept, is 3D. Now 3D is a deeply complex subject, so we are only going to open the surface of it. But it is one of the things that you can play with here in the columns of your layers. Each one of these layers you can turn on 3D elements. So for example, here on, notice the transform functions now. And if I go to the graphics and I turn on the 3D functions, you get more options, including position is now X, Y, and Z. Z is the space coming as it comes towards you. So if X is going to the mountain, Y is going up the mountain, Z is coming off the screen. I know that's a mixed metaphor, but I think you can work with that. So what I can do is I'm going to play with rotation. So rotation, let's see, I want to do this. So I can play with rotation. If I play with Y rotation, it's going to, remember Y goes up the mountain, so it's going to rotate on that Y axis, the up axis. So I can go, let's try this, I'll put that back to 0. I can go back to my original keyframe. I can add a keyframe at Y. I can go to my next keyframe, add a keyframe at Y, and I will go back to the first one and change this Y rotation. It's off the screen, but I can change it to about -80. And then now when I play this, it'll take a minute to render. You'll see that will not only animate, but it will animate in with a 3-dimensional rotation to it. It's coming. There you go. This is a little overly dramatic. I gave you some large files. You can see as you play back the first time, After Effects needs to render things live. We're going to look into how to adjust that more in the future, but I'm going to kind of skip that right now in our foundational elements because I just want us to focus on the goods. Okay, so you can see how we're both moving things in the timeline, but also in 3 dimensions. So I'm going to stop this and play it again. So that's our fourth element, which is 3D rotations. The next thing that we can do is add a effect. I'm going to close this. So I have various things here. I have the Disney Concert Hall. I have some clouds which are rolling in the background. Those clouds I could also move. It's a video. I can move those around. So for example, I can go back here. I can add a position. I'm going to move back. I'm going to play with scale. And so here my position has a keyframe. Then I'm going to go over here and add another keyframe. And on the second keyframe, I will change the location of this video. So the video will also move as it plays. Okay, so let's say looks like it's a sunset sort of video. So what I want to do is I want to add an effect to this. I want it to kind of go from something more subtle to something more bold, like it's actually going through sunset. So what we can do here is I select this layer, video playback, and I'm going to go to Effect. I'm going to first open up the effect controls, and the effect controls is going to show up here over your project window. Now you can still get to it by selecting this project window, but right now the effect controls are overlaying the project venue. So here I have the effects controls of the video playback, which is the cloud layer, and I'm going to add a color correction. And I'm going to say, let's look for hue saturation. And what this does is, in addition to the transform function, now there is an effects function, also of which we will be able to add keyframes. So let's go ahead and go to I'm going to turn colorize on, and I'm actually going to make colorize saturation. I'll add a keyframe here. And then a keyframe here. And let's go back to the original keyframe, and I'll make that color saturation really low, so it's going to be black and white. And the effect will change and animate as well. There are a huge amount of effects, and we will go through those later in the semester of the term. But effects is another foundational term. Now the last and final function that we are going to play with is the idea of rendering. And rendering we're going to cover entirely in another video, so I'm going to stop it a little bit early here, and we will pick this up in another video when we are rendering. But other than that, we have created compositions, layers, animations, 3D, effects, and rendering. If you'd like a more in-depth discussion of what these are, please check out the Linea video also on this page, and that will give you a deeper look into these functions. All right, thank you.